A rancher found a bleeding woman and 7 kids in his barn. What he did next changed Montana forever. The barn door creaked in protest as Eli Thatcher pushed it open with his shoulder, lantern raised, boots already heavy with snowmelt from the blizzard that had rolled through the valley overnight. He wasn't expecting anything but cold hay and maybe a birthing calf. But what he found instead knocked the breath clean out of him. In the far corner, crumpled between sacks of feed, was a woman. Bleeding from the shoulder, her face pale as ash, one arm curled protectively around something. No. Someone. A child. No. Children. His eyes adjusted slowly as the lantern flame steadied, and 7 small, shivering figures took shape around her like frightened deer, their clothes soaked, lips blue, eyes wide and silent. The oldest, a boy, maybe 10, held a rusted skillet like a weapon. The youngest couldn't have been older than 2, clinging to the woman's bloody skirts, sucking her thumb in dazed rhythm. Eli didn't speak right away. His hand gripped the doorframe as if the cold truth of the moment might knock him down otherwise. The woman blinked at him once, then tried to lift her head, but her body betrayed her. "They followed us," she rasped. "We ran, but they—" Her voice gave out. The boy stepped in front of her like a shadow thrown from courage he hadn't grown into yet. "Don't touch her," he said. "She ain't yours." Eli set the lantern down slowly. "She's bleeding out. I ain't here to hurt nobody." His voice was calm but edged with something sharp, because whoever put this woman in such a state was still out there. He pulled off his coat and knelt, pressing the thick wool against her wound, feeling the heat of her blood through the fabric. Her eyes flicked toward the children, then back to him, glassy with pain and fear. "Don't take them," she whispered. "Please. Just let them stay together." Eli looked at the line of shaking bodies, some barefoot, all too thin for this weather. And something inside him, something older than his anger, older than the land itself, settled into place. "No one's taken anybody," he muttered, tightening the coat. "Not tonight." The boy lowered his skillet just an inch. Outside, the wind howled past the barn like a warning, but inside, a single fragile warmth had sparked. Eli didn't know their names, their story, or what devil had driven them here. But he knew one thing for certain. They weren't going back out into that snow. Not while he was breathing. Eli hadn't slept. Not really. He dragged in 2 extra blankets from the bunkhouse, stoked the barn stove until it glowed orange against the planks, and boiled water on a tin kettle that hadn't seen use since spring branding. The woman, who still hadn't given her name, drifted in and out of consciousness, her breath shallow, her shoulder packed with clean rags and bound tight with Eli's old bandana. By dawn, the wind had eased, but the silence inside the barn hadn't. The children sat in a tight semicircle, watching every move he made like animals who had been trapped too many times before. One little girl, curly-haired, missing her left boot, started to cry when the sun slipped through a knothole and lit her brother's bruised cheek. It wasn't loud, just a soft, shaking sound, like she'd forgotten how to cry proper. Then another started. Then another. Soon, the whole group sat huddled around their mother, weeping in the raw, unfiltered way only children can when they're finally safe enough to fall apart. Eli crouched by the stove, staring into the flame, his hands stilled over a pan of cornbread batter he hadn't realized he was mixing. He didn't have the words. He didn't know how to talk to 8 children who'd seen hell and kept walking. "You got names?" he asked, not turning. No one answered. "Not asking to register you or anything, just can't call you all kid." After a long pause, the oldest boy, freckled, sharp-eyed, and still wary, spoke. I'm Micah. That's Ruthie. Then Levi, Anna, James, Sarah, Benny, and baby's Grace. Eli nodded slowly, filing each name into memory like fence posts set in thawing ground. All right then, Micah. Reckon you're the man of the house now, huh? Micah's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. I guess. The woman stirred then, wincing. Her eyes fluttered open and locked on Eli's face with exhausted clarity. They ain't mine, she whispered. Only 2 are. The others, they were left. I couldn't leave them too. Eli swallowed something hard. He looked at her, then at the children, all looking back as if her truth had cracked something open. Doesn't matter whose blood they are, he said quietly. They're yours now, and they're mine, for as long as they need to be. No one spoke after that. But Micah sat a little straighter, and Ruthie crawled closer to the woman's hand. And the barn, still full of straw, blood, and cold, felt, for the first time, a little bit like a home. The farmhouse kitchen hadn't been used for more than 2 people in years, and now Eli found himself laying out tin plates like it was Sunday, and he'd opened a boarding house by accident. He moved quiet, careful not to stir the woman sleeping in the small bed by the stove. Her breathing deeper now, the fever easing. He didn't know her name yet, but the kids had started calling her Mama in unison, no matter who she was or wasn't born to. The kettle hissed softly as steam rolled over the battered rim. Micah helped crack eggs into a dented bowl, while James tried to mash potatoes with the back of a spoon, his tiny hands trembling with cold and nerves. Eli handed Ruthie a warm slice of skillet bread straight from the pan, and she stared at it like it was a golden bar, turning it over in both hands before finally nibbling. You all slept in that barn how long? Eli asked, not expecting an answer. 3 nights, Micah said. Before that, an old trapper's cabin. Before that, I don't know. Mama just kept moving us. Eli grunted softly, the sound neither judgment nor surprise. Smart woman. Micah watched him like a man 3 times his age. Why'd you let us stay? Couldn't rightly carry on knowing I sent 8 kids back out into the snow, Eli said, flipping another egg. Sides, barn needed cleaning anyway. That won him a ghost of a smile. Anna crawled up beside her brother with a fork in her hand, like she'd fought a war to earn it. Eli crouched by the stove, pulling a battered coffee tin from the coals, and said quietly, Tell your mama, when she wakes, that her wound's clean and the fever's breaking. I'll ride into town for supplies, maybe Doc Parker too, if he'll ride. You all will stay here, long as you need. Micah nodded solemnly, but his voice broke when he whispered, Thank you, sir. And that was when the woman stirred behind them and rasped her first word since the night before. Eli. He turned. Her eyes were open, weak but clear, locked on him. I remember you. From Carter's Ferry. You saved a girl from a fire. Eli blinked. That had been over 6 years ago. A child stuck in a flaming barn, screaming until her voice went raw. He'd never known who she was. That was you? She nodded faintly. Didn't think I'd owe you twice. He stepped closer, voice low and warm. Let's just say Montana likes to make circles out of Old Mercy. The next morning, the valley was hushed under a thick blanket of snow, the kind that silenced even the crows and turned every hoofprint into a secret. Eli stood on the porch with his rifle slung low and a pot of coffee steaming beside him. The children were inside, still asleep in a tangle of quilts and straw-stuffed pillows. And the woman, Miriam, she had finally whispered, rested on the couch, her wound no longer bleeding but still angry red beneath the gauze. The peace didn't last. Around Around mid-morning, a sound came down from the pass, distant, deliberate, and wrong. Hooves. 2 riders. Slow, looking for something. Eli watched them through the trees, their outlines cutting the snow like razors. One tall, wearing a gray coat and slouched hat. The other, wiry, jerky movements like a man too comfortable with violence. He didn't move until they reached the first fence post. Then he stepped down into the snow, calm and unhurried, the way men do when they're no longer afraid of dying. "Mornin'," the taller one called, forcing cheer into his voice. Heard tell a group of vagrants might have passed through these parts. Woman, children, might have stolen a mule from New Hope Station. Eli didn't blink. "Ain't seen anyone but the wind." The wiry one leaned forward. "That so? Barn looks like it's been stirred lately. Warm tracks in the snow. Awful lot of boots for a single man spread." Eli let silence stretch, the kind that makes lesser men sweat. Then he said, "Folks pass through. Snow drives 'em in. I feed 'em, send 'em on, like any decent man would." "Decent," the wiry one echoed, eyes flicking toward the barn, then back. "Well, if you do see anything, you let Sheriff Mallory know. Town's offering a small reward for information. Runaways are property out here, especially those that ain't legal kin." That last line hit hard. Eli smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Only thing I own on this land are my horses and my regrets. You want to chase ghosts? Try the canyon trail." The 2 men lingered another breath, then turned their horses, vanishing slow into the pines. Eli stood still until the hoofbeats disappeared entirely. Then he walked back toward the house. As he opened the door, Micah was waiting just inside, holding a carving knife with shaking hands. "They after us?" the boy asked. Eli closed the door behind him and knelt beside the boy. "Yeah, but they'll have to go through me first." Eli hitched his horse just outside Dawson's Dry Goods, snow still clinging to the cuffs of his coat. He didn't like coming into town, not anymore. Too many eyes. Too many names whispered behind hands. But the woman in his home, Miriam, and 8 frightened children needed food, medicine, and firewood, and he wasn't about to let pride get in the way of mercy. Inside the store, Mrs. Farnsworth gave him the usual tight smile. "Didn't expect you in this week, Eli." "Didn't expect to be," he replied, pulling a list from his pocket. "Need sugar, flour, salt, coffee, also powdered milk, bandages, carbolic acid if you've got it, and anything warm for little ones." Her brows rose. "You finally take in boarders?" "Something like that." He didn't offer more. She didn't ask. But word spread fast in a town like this. By the time he'd loaded the last sack onto his horse, 3 men had taken notice. Mr. Bragg from the livery, Sheriff Mallory's deputy, and a local ranch hand who didn't much like strangers. Bragg stepped forward, voice syrupy. "Here you've got a woman holed up at your place. Bleeding one. 7 or 8 kids, too. Can't be legal." Eli's jaw flexed. "Don't recall asking the law for permission to hand out bread." "You harboring fugitives?" the deputy asked, a little too loud. "That ain't just kindness, Eli. That's aiding and abetting." Eli stepped forward slow, like a man who'd had this conversation in his head all morning. "They ain't property, ain't livestock. They're folks who needed help. I gave it." "You sure about that choice?" The ranch hand sneered. "Town might not stand for it." "Then the town can answer to me," Eli said flatly. "One man against a law-bound valley?" Bragg chuckled. "You forget how Montana works?" "No," Eli said, mounting his horse. "But maybe Montana needs reminding how mercy does." As he rode out of town, the snow began falling again. Soft, steady, unbothered by men's politics. And back at the ranch, Miriam sat up by the fire, children asleep at her feet, the warmth of something larger than survival blooming quietly behind her tired eyes. The wind rattled the shutters just before dawn, but inside Eli's cabin, it was the soft sound of breathing that filled the space. 8 children, curled under quilts and patched blankets, slept close on the floor near the fire, their warmth stitched together like a single heartbeat. Miriam stirred slowly, wincing as she shifted upright on the couch, her bandaged side pulling against the wool wrap. She looked toward the window and then toward the man sleeping in the chair by the hearth, hat tipped low, rifle propped near his leg. Eli hadn't left the cabin once since returning from town, save to check the fences and split more wood. She watched him for a long time before speaking. "You didn't have to stay." He stirred but didn't lift his head. "Didn't have to let you in either." "Why did you?" she asked quietly. Eli sat up, rubbing his neck. "Because someone once let me in, when I didn't deserve it. That kind of thing. It sticks to a man. Makes him want to pass it on." Miriam looked down at her hands, fingers chapped from cold, but steady now. "The men who were chasing us, they're not law. They're a private ring, trade in desperation. They were going to take the children, sell them, or worse." Eli didn't flinch, but his grip tightened on the arm of the chair. "You got names?" "2, I heard. Sloan and Greeley, always looking for widows and orphans traveling alone. Picked us up outside Helena, promised food and work. Turned mean once they saw I couldn't pay." Eli stood and stoked the fire. "I know Greeley. Used to ride with McHale's outfit before he turned rotten." He glanced toward the door. "If they come back, they'll want blood." Not answers. Miriam's voice trembled, but held. "They always come back." "Let 'em," Eli said, looking at her fully now. "But this time, someone's waiting." The cabin, once hollow with years of silence and dust, felt alive again, like it had exhaled. The kind of home that didn't ask questions, only gave warmth. As the fire crackled and the children stirred, Miriam lay back down slowly, her eyes on the ceiling. She whispered, "This place feels like it remembers how to protect." Eli didn't answer. But as he stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, boots heavy on the frozen boards, the cabin, like the man who kept it, felt ready to defend something worth saving. By mid-morning, a hawk circled above the tree line, gliding low over the canyon trail where the snow melted faster than anywhere else. Eli had ridden out just past dawn, tracking boot prints he'd found behind the barn. 2 sets, heavy, deliberate, fresh. He followed them into the shadowed part of the valley where snow clung longer and the air always felt colder. The trail led toward Old Man's Notch, a narrow pass known more to outlaws than ranchers, and Eli's jaw tightened with every step his horse took. By the time he reached the bend, he saw them, Sloan and Greeley, discussing something at the creek's edge, rifles slung across their backs, a canvas bag at their feet that looked far too small to hold anything but malice. Eli dismounted without sound. "You picked the wrong season to come back," he said. They spun, hands twitching toward triggers. "Well, look who found his courage," Sloan sneered. "That bleeding woman in your cabin belongs to us." "She ain't an object," Eli replied, voice flat. "And those kids, they're under my roof now." Greeley laughed. "You always were soft. This valley's built on men who take what's weak and make it worth something. You think you're going to change that with pity and beans?" Eli lifted his rifle, just enough to make a point without making a grave. "I think I'm going to change it with bullets if I have to." The air froze, and for a long second, No one moved. Then Sloane said, "You won't shoot. You're a rancher, not a killer." "No," Eli said. "But I'm also a man who knows that mercy don't mean not fighting." A shot rang, not from Eli's rifle, but from behind. Greeley dropped with a scream, his leg clipped clean through. Miriam stood behind a rock ledge, holding Eli's second rifle with both hands, breathing like she'd just broken through a lifetime of fear. Sloane stared at her in disbelief. "You?" Miriam's voice shook. "You sold girls my sister's age. Called it debt." Sloane dropped his weapon and raised his hands. "You can't protect her forever, Eli. Winter ends, people talk." "Then let 'em," Eli growled, binding Greeley's leg as the man howled. "Let 'em talk about a man who stood up." Miriam stepped closer, the rifle lowering as her fingers eased. "And a woman who finally stopped running." Snow began to fall again, soft and defiant, covering the blood on the trail like Montana's way of forgiving just enough to let something new grow. The sun was low behind the hills when Eli and Miriam rode side by side into the canyon. Greeley tied to Eli's second horse, groaning with each jolt. Sloane had vanished into the trees, one hand bloodied, one eye watching like a snake retreating, not brave enough to stay, not foolish enough to try again soon. Eli didn't bother chasing him. The point had been made. The rest would be settled by the land, by winter, by justice in some form or another. Miriam clutched the reins tightly, her knuckles pale, but her posture was taller than Eli had ever seen it. She didn't ask what came next. Neither of them did. As the cabin came into view, smoke trailing from its chimney like a banner of survival, the sound of children's laughter leaked through the cold. They were playing in the yard, building shapes in the snow with sticks and stones. The oldest girl holding the youngest's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. The moment they saw Miriam, they ran to her. "Mama!" She slid off the horse, collapsing to her knees in the snow as the children swarmed around her, touching her face, her hands, her coat, as if afraid she might vanish again. Eli watched from the saddle for a moment, then turned to drag Greeley off the horse. He tied him to the hitching post like unwanted cargo and left him there in the cold. "He'll live," he muttered to Miriam, "but not without a limp, and not without shame." "He doesn't deserve death," she said quietly. "But I hope he remembers this every time he tries to hurt someone again." Eli nodded, impressed not by her forgiveness, but by the steadiness in her tone. Inside, the fire had already been stoked by the older children, who had started to treat the place like home without even meaning to. There were bowls set out, bread warming on the hearthstone, and a pair of small wooden figures one of the boys had carved now sitting on the windowsill. One tall, one shorter, side by side. Miriam stood in the center of it all, coat damp with melted snow, and said softly, "This was supposed to be a place we passed through." Eli met her eyes. "Sometimes the road ends sooner than you think." The wind howled outside, but inside, the walls no longer echoed. They breathed. The storm came hard that night, blanketing the ranch in a thick silence that muffled even the wolves. But inside Eli's cabin, warmth pulsed from every corner. The children had fallen asleep together near the fire, limbs tangled, faces flushed from bread and laughter. Miriam sat on the edge of the rocking chair, mending a shirt sleeve by lantern light, her movement slow but sure, no longer the ghost who had arrived bleeding and silent. Eli leaned in the doorway with a mug of coffee cooling in his hand, watching her. Not like a man studying a stranger, but like one remembering what it was to witness steadiness grow in a place that used to be hollow. "You built this place for one," Miriam said softly. "Now it holds 9. Eli chuckled once, then stepped forward. I didn't build it for silence. I just forgot what it sounded like to live. She looked up. Needle paused. You mean, you were waiting? I mean, Eli said, setting the mug down beside her. I didn't know I was missing anything until you brought it back. The wind beat against the windows, but the logs held firm, and the firelight painted their faces with soft gold. One of the boys stirred, then rolled over, mumbling in his sleep. Miriam's gaze drifted toward the children. They've started calling you Uncle Eli. He smiled faintly. Could do worse. They need a home, she whispered. A real one, not just shelter. Eli crouched beside her now, voice low but steady. Then let's make it one. All of us? She asked. All of us, he confirmed. You're not passing through anymore. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. I believe you, she whispered. And it wasn't just words. It was the breath of someone who'd finally been allowed to stop running. Outside, the snow piled higher. But the cabin, once empty enough to echo, was full now. Not just with bodies, but with voices, warmth, and the quiet kind of love that grows not from rescue, but from choosing to stay. By early spring, the snow had melted into memory, and the mud had dried into hard, packed earth, leaving behind a yard where laughter came easier. The barn, once cold, dark, and silent, was now swept clean, with hay stacked high and tools hung straight on the wall. Where a bleeding woman had once crouched behind a trough, now hung a row of tiny coats on pegs, carved and nailed in by Eli himself. Miriam stood just outside the open doors, holding the youngest child, barely more than a baby, on her hip, as the others chased chickens and shouted nonsense across the corral. Eli was inside the barn, working on the stall gate, whistling a tune that had no name but felt like home. You know, she said, stepping closer, this barn saved our lives. He straightened and turned toward her, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. It wasn't the barn, he said. It was you. You stayed. You fought. You didn't give up. She smiled faintly. I was out of options. Eli shook his head. You had a choice. You chose to protect them. And now, look. He gestured toward the children, toward the ranch, toward the hills that cradled the land like old hands. This place isn't mine anymore. It's ours. Miriam stepped forward slowly, handed him the baby, and watched how naturally Eli settled the child into his arms. You know what the town folks are saying? She asked. That a bunch of nobodies changed a hardened rancher? Eli chuckled. Let 'em talk. Maybe they'll remember that mercy doesn't make a man weak, it makes him brave. The wind rustled through the budding trees, and the sunlight filtered through the barn slats in soft gold. She touched the beam where she'd first leaned for strength and whispered, This place used to be where I thought I'd die. Eli stood beside her now, holding the baby close, his voice low. Then it's a good place to start living. As the children's laughter echoed across the valley and the barn doors stood open to the warm wind, it became clear that what began in silence and fear had become something else entirely. Not just a home, not just a family, but proof that the hardest winters can still give way to the gentlest springs. If this story touched your heart, ride with us again. Like, share, and subscribe. And visit the channel for full cinematic long stories.